Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I wanted to talk about the sensation of a book that has been Sally Rooney's Intermezzo. And I'll talk about some parts that will go into some spoilers. I'll try and do a bit beforehand where I sort of leave it as open as possible, just in case you're still wanting to read the book and don't want anything spoiled. But basically just to say, this is a book that it's always interesting, every sort of release of a new Sally Rooney book, because in many ways the buzz around the book and the discussion and the conversations about everything to do with Sally Rooney and who she is and the Sally Rooney effect, all I think get in the way of actual sort of discussion of the books. As in, I think, Beautiful World, Where Are You, which I really greatly enjoyed. I thought was a really beautifully done book. I think so much of the conversation was just Sally Rooney does it again. And actually, I think that in some ways that actually doesn't really allow enough scope to really zone in on the really clever things I think that she's doing. And also, I will say, I think right off the jump, I think so much of that conversation is already a gendered one, right? It's sort of, it's less is said about a sort of a big splashing kind of book from a male author. I think a lot of the Sally Rooney effect is sort of seen as, well, if it's a kind of the classic thing about if it's a thing enjoyed by young women, it's sort of something pushed to one side and sort of seen as not cool or not kind of critically acclaimed. And actually, I think Sally Rooney has been able to tap into something in a big way. Her books are popular for a reason, because I think she does something particularly incisive in the way that she looks at the interiority of characters. I think she does some really clever things with dissections of conversations around power and sex and violence and gender and various other things. And I think there's a lot more going on behind the scenes than the sort of Sally Rooney buzz would have us think is going on, because I think so much of that conversation is sort of, completely unfocused on the books. So let's do a little bit of that here today. I'm not going to sort of promise to be sort of a fully kind of grasping with every single part of the book, but I will sort of do my best to sort of talk about what I think is going on here. So let's get started first with a broad brushstrokes introduction about what this book is about. So the kind of the premise of the book seems in many ways a fairly standard one. We have two brothers, Peter and Ivan. They are in various stages of their lives, and they are sort of in various different relationships with women. And those relationships seem to unravel a little bit more about who they are, but also about the kind of wider state of things as well. So, for example, Ivan is a chess player, sort of has been playing from a very young age, or relatively young age, and his sort of life has been shaped by that. This kind of, even his accent is seen as being shaped by him playing chess. And so his life is sort of very much about this. He starts getting involved with a woman called Margaret, who keeps on being referred to in the book as being significantly older. I think he's in his early 20s, she's 35 or 36 or something. It's not huge in the grand scheme of things, but there we go. And part of the sort of the challenge within their relationship is that they are in very different stages of their lives, but also have very different expectations around relationships and various other things. And there is an element where Rooney, I think, is playing with the power dynamic there, because the gender imbalance is almost offset by a kind of a dynamic around age. And so there's a wider discussion about what power looks like there as well. We also then have Peter, who is sort of starting to make forays into dating someone else, but it's very clear that he has a lot of history with another woman, and so the book is setting up a conversation there as well about that, and particularly the age gap in that relationship inverts some of these things. So he is a slightly older man in a relationship with a slightly younger woman, but where there's also an imbalance around money and various other things. So the book immediately sets that up, and the book, for the most part, the story really focuses in on those relationships, on what that means, what the kind of dynamics are, what that looks like in a more modern society, what it might have looked like previously, what the expectations of everybody else around them would be. And I think this is actually where she's sort of sometimes at her most deft as a writer. I think Sally Rooney is really good at investigating the little nuances of that. So what does it look like to kind of date someone when you're fairly new to dating someone, but they are this far more experienced woman who does not need you in quite the same way that maybe he, Ivan, as a sort of an early 20s man, might feel like he needs a relationship. And so it plays around with a lot of these dynamics, and I think it's really intelligent. And without going into spoilers about what comes up later in the book, I think that these dynamics really show just a really beautiful insight into her characters. I think Sally Rooney has done an incredible job at dissecting some of the small nuances of what it feels like to be waiting by the phone for somebody to call, or even then to be on the phone with that person and to not fully know if you're getting your point across, or even if you've just been brushed off and haven't actually realized that you're being dumped or kind of being disinvited from future dates in that moment. And I think it's a really intelligently done thing. And I think particularly the relationship between the two brothers really starts to crystallize within that. I won't go into full details here, I'll save that for the spoiler section, but the two brothers then have to work out where they both stand, and a big part of that conversation is also a particularly tricky one. And so I think again the book elevates itself to having these broader, more detailed conversations about some of these things. Long story short, from the 3 of hers I've read now, I've still not read Conversations with Friends. I will at some point. This is probably the one I've enjoyed most, I think. Beautiful World, Where Are You? I really loved as well. Normal People I enjoyed. I didn't kind of gel with me in quite the same way as something like this. And let's go on to talk a little bit about some of the spoilers and what that might mean. If you do need to drop off, by all means, please do. But basically, my sort of thesis statement for the video is I think this book is well done. I think it's an incredibly incisive book around human relationships, and particularly vulnerabilities and how we hold on to those things. And I think Sally Rooney's writing feels sharper than it has in previous books in really interrogating some of those things, even becoming slightly more formally experimental or kind of playing around with the page slightly more. So this feels like an even more sort of elevated version for me of the Sally Rooney that I really enjoyed in Beautiful World, Where Are You? And with that, let's go on to some spoilers. So at first in the book, I was a little nervous that the theme of chess was going to get really overplayed and overused that was an unintentional pun about overplayed. It was going to get really overused within the book. And, sometimes you see this in books with aspirations of literariness, where they will sort of introduce a thing, and that is a thing that really means a lot. And actually, I think she plays it quite well with chess in this book, where it's used more as a sort of a proxy to talk about Ivan feeling slightly awkward, or Ivan's sort of inner world and the way that he is trying to have these matchups with other people and kind of try to excel. And I think she focuses more on that and what it kind of does to his psyche to be in a state of constantly having to perform, more than a kind of she is the queen, Margaret is the queen and she is trying to get captured, all this kind of thing. And I think that's really good. I'm very appreciative of the fact that she didn't go for the really obvious sort of over-laden metaphor in this. And I think particularly where that really works is there are moments where chess serves as a particularly useful function for sort of other proxies in the book. So there are chess games. Will Margaret go and see a chess game and therefore support him, or will she not? Is he lying when he says that various games are happening or tournaments are happening and actually he wasn't there at all? Does his brother resent him for this, or does his brother see him as a genius, as he constantly refers to him as and introduces him to other people as? And actually, does he get trapped? Does Ivan get trapped as being the genius because of this early sort of prodigious talent for chess? And also it kind of speaks to the kind of, in a competitive world of sort of tournaments and things like that, where does he stand when he doesn't actually care about the sport anymore, or where he never quite reaches the top success? Kind of like when you see sort of sports stars who were really big in their local clubs and never quite make it to the Premier League, for example. And we might see them as failures in some kind of narratives, but actually they've still been incredibly special in many other ways. And so I think this book really interrogates that for Ivan's character, and particularly someone like Margaret, who I find really fascinating in this book, because she has this sort of detached sense of interacting with Ivan at the beginning of the book, which then sort of softens. But there's definitely a sense where her holding off on these relationships has a wider sort of narrative point, that there is a kind of gulf between these two characters and between many characters in the book that can't always fully be bridged by just having a conversation. And as we hear with the interiority, the kind of inner voices and inner thoughts of all of these characters, we know that there's far more stopping them from getting involved in some of these things than might at first appear apparent. And so in some ways the chess metaphor kind of comes back, but I think is not overly burdened here, with this idea that there's an unknowability about other people, and to some degree all you're trying to do is play a game of moving your pieces and watching as they move theirs, and kind of hope that you find some way in the middle. But actually, obviously, as the characters come to think about, that's not always the case. You can't always just bluster your way through and try and win. A relationship is something that needs to be a kind of a conversation, a kind of a meeting in the middle, and that's not something that chess or any of the other kind of competition in the book, such as between the two brothers, really happily engenders. That doesn't really exist. You need to kind of meet this as a kind of a meeting of minds, and kind of relationships need to have that kind of element to them. So I think this is where the book's particularly strong, and I really loved that aspect of it. I think the book does some really insightful things in understanding just the sheer terror that goes behind going on a date with someone, or trying to get to know someone closer and have them get to know you better. We're constantly fighting with the fact that to be known or to be sort of seen or perceived by somebody is an utterly terrifying act at times. It's a very necessary one, and humans need it, but also it's utterly terrifying because it involves being seen for sort of everything you might be. I think the book does some really exceptional things in how it sort of creates that. And one thing I particularly want to highlight, which I think is really commendable in this book and really sold the final part of the book for me as well. And obviously we're in spoiler section anyway, but this is right at the end of the book as well. So extra spoiler warnings. But towards the end of the book, Peter is basically realizing that he may be in love with two women at the same time. And we have the person he's sort of been dating that started as a more transactional thing, which has become something deeper and where he feels needed. But he also has a sort of former love who he kind of can't quite stop loving. And the two women seem to sort of understand this about him, that there's some element to which he can love them both, but also that that's an incredibly difficult situation and an incredibly new situation for them both. But also something I find really fascinating in the way Rooney writes that feels almost radical in some ways is her blowing up of the traditional trope around that. Traditional tropes would have the main character or the man in the situation choose between two parts of a love triangle, or leave, or have both women frustrated and leave themselves. And actually Rooney imagines a world in which that doesn't have to be a choice. She essentially looks at some of the conversations around things around polyamorous relationships, or around sort of open relationships, or various other things, various other forms of sort of ethical non-monogamy and other parts of it. And it actually was really interesting because I was reading a book about non-monogamy around the same time as reading this, and there was a fun little crossover with that. And although Rooney doesn't really state that in sort of black and white terms, she doesn't explicitly talk about kind of it as being ethical non-monogamy or what have you. She talks about the ways that words fail us, and that actually for Peter, he loves these two women and cares very deeply about them, and societally that doesn't really exist as a term or a phrase or a word that he could use to describe this. He to some degree is just trying to navigate feelings that he's having whilst also not having the language to be able to express that. And so he wants to say all these things, he's feeling all these things, and we as the reader, because of his inner thoughts, know that he's thinking about all of these things, but we also know that he doesn't know how to phrase it or to express it. And to some degree that allows a wider conversation that I think is a lot more radical, which is Rooney basically saying our concept of relationships or of relationship structures potentially have some real sort of issues in them, or the kind of something about the foundation of them is somewhat wonky, that they don't allow for things like this. They don't allow for these possibilities that are very real and bring in some interesting discussions. I think Oisin McKenna's book recently, Evenings and Weekends, does an absolutely fantastic job of also exploding some of these categories, or exploding kind of commonly held thoughts around this. But it's so striking to see an author with the kind of the sales and platform of someone like Rooney, really exploring, actually, does this make sense? Does the structure that we currently believe in of sort of what care looks like, what love looks like, does that allow for people to live their best lives in a way like Peter is in some ways able to and not able to within the book? And I think that's where she's really interesting here, that she is able to explode some of these notions, but also acknowledge the difficulties of it. For some of the characters in this book, those relationship structures seem to work. But I think Rooney is allowing us to question on a broader level, but what if that doesn't work for you? Where do you fit, and where do you fit within power structures if you're not able to do that? And I think that's something that's so interesting about this book, and I find is a really quietly powerful core of this book, is her essentially challenging received norms about relationships and what that should look like, whether that's because there's an age difference or there are various other factors at play. What does that look like when we imagine a different world? And that in many ways feels very fitting with a lot of Rooney's other wider politics of let's imagine something different and let's start to challenge some of these norms, whether that is pointing out the kind of ridiculousness of a South Dublin accent appearing in her brother's tone and how that's a basically newly fabricated accent, whether that is a relationship structure that doesn't work. She is very much of the opinion that the world is constantly changing and rebuilding and reforming itself to fit things that we need, but also sometimes that these things are burdens and these things are things that stop us from imagining anything different. And so I really like that this book does this. And so again, this is why I find it really frustrating when I think her books are kind of consigned to the label of something of being chick lit. And again, nothing wrong itself with that genre or kind of the books that fall within that. But I think it's so often used to demean books because of what they write about, because just writing about women in relationships is often seen as being less worthy of critical engagement. And I think Sally Rooney is really able to reposition that and say, actually, there's a lot of really interesting critical engagement that can happen at that crossroads of various things, of various power structures, of various relationship types, of various people. And actually, that is worth examining. Those lives are worth examining. And everybody's interior lives in this book are given the kind of credence that they deserve. Nobody here is sort of given an inner voice of someone useless and pointless. They all have valid thoughts and feelings and frustrations, and all of those things are real. Just because they might not fit within certain worldviews or might challenge other forms of status quo does not mean they're less worthy of examination. And I think that's where Rooney is particularly strong in this book, that I think is just really well done. I love books that focus deeply on someone's inner thoughts, and I think Rooney is just so good at capturing those little nuances of how people might feel on a day-to-day basis, particularly in a society that might not be particularly open at talking about these things. So anyway, that long ramble aside, I think this book is pretty damn good. I really like what she's done here. And although it's not my sort of, I don't often read as many things that maybe fall within that. I think the level of interiority and the seriousness with which she graciously gives characters voices and inner lives, I think is what makes her an author that's connected with so many people. I think that is the Rooney effect, that she cares about people and she cares about their lives and giving them the space to explore those lives. And I think that's what makes her really special. Anyway, take care. I've been Bob the Booker and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.